Picture this: a vast battlefield at dawn, the air thick with tension as two armies stand poised for combat. But before the first arrow flies, something unexpected happens. Thunderous war drums begin to pound, shaking the ground beneath the soldiers' feet. Strange, haunting chants rise from the enemy ranks, their voices echoing like ghosts through the mist. Then, a sudden silence followed by the chilling sight of warriors adorned in terrifying masks, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions of rage and madness. This wasn't just intimidation, it was psychological warfare, a weapon as deadly as any sword or spear. Long before modern technology, ancient commanders mastered the art of manipulating fear, deception, and perception to break their enemies without ever landing a blow. These tactics weren't just about brute strength, they were about outthinking the opponent, exploiting human psychology to sow doubt, panic, and paralysis. Imagine being a soldier in that moment, facing an enemy who seemed more like a force of nature than men. Your resolve would crumble, your discipline would waver, and by the time the battle began, you'd already lost. From the terrifying war cries of the Vikings to the eerie silence of the Spartans at Thermopylae, history is filled with armies who understood that the mind is the real battlefield. And here's the fascinating part: these strategies aren't confined to ancient history. You'll find them in modern military maneuvers, in the bluff and counter-bluff of high-stakes business, even in the mind games of competitive sports. The principles remain the same: control the narrative, dominate perception, and victory follows. So how did ancient commanders without satellites, drones, or propaganda machines achieve such mastery over their enemies' minds? That's the journey we're about to take through 20 of history's most ingenious, daring, and sometimes downright bizarre uses of psychological warfare. We'll uncover how Hannibal turned the Alps into a weapon of terror, how Genghis Khan used rumor as his deadliest ally, and how a single, well-placed mirror could decide the fate of an empire. This isn't just a list, it's a testament to human cunning, a reminder that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't steel, it's the unseen force of fear, surprise, and sheer audacity. Ready to see how minds, not just armies, won wars? Let's begin. The story of the Trojan Horse isn't just a myth, it's one of history's most brilliant acts of psychological manipulation. After 10 grueling years of failed attacks on Troy, the Greeks realized brute force wouldn't win this war, so they devised a plan that played not on strength, but on the Trojans' exhaustion and hope. Pretending to sail away, they left behind a colossal wooden horse, an offering to the gods, or so it seemed. Inside its hollow belly, elite Greek soldiers waited in silence, their hearts pounding as the Trojans debated whether to bring the gift within their walls. Imagine the scene: a city weary of war, desperate for relief, clinging to the belief that their enemies had finally given up. That vulnerability was the Greeks' real weapon. The Trojans' celebration was their downfall. By the time they realized the horse was a trap, it was too late. The hidden warriors emerged under cover of night, opening the gates for the returning Greek army. What makes this story timeless isn't just the deception, but the layers of psychology at work. The Greeks exploited trust, the universal human desire to believe the conflict was over. They weaponized complacency, the moment when vigilance fades and disaster strikes. And perhaps most cunningly, they turned the Trojans' own rituals against them, using the horse as a sacred offering to bypass suspicion. This wasn't just a trick, it was a masterclass in understanding the enemy's mindset, and it set the stage for centuries of warfare where perception mattered as much as force. But deception wasn't the only tool in the ancient world's psychological arsenal. While the Greeks relied on stealth, others would wield terror openly, turning fear itself into a battlefield advantage. Hannibal Barca understood something most generals of his time didn't. Terror could be more devastating than any sword. When he marched his Carthaginian army across the towering Alps to invade Rome, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought elephants, not the domesticated beasts used for labor, but towering war elephants, their hides armored, their tusks fitted with blades, their sheer presence enough to send seasoned Roman legions into chaos. Picture the scene: Roman troops, disciplined and confident, forming their battle lines only to freeze as the ground began to tremble. Then, through the dust, emerged creatures straight out of myth. The elephants' deafening trumpets echoed like thunder, their massive feet crushing everything in their path. To the Romans, these weren't just animals. They were monsters, something utterly alien to the battlefields of Europe. The psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers dropped their weapons. Tight formations shattered as men scrambled backward, tripping over each other in their desperation to escape. Hannibal didn't just rely on the elephants' physical might, he weaponized their strangeness. The Romans had trained to fight human enemies, not beasts that towered over them, shrugging off spears and arrows. The scent of the elephants alone sent horses bolting in panic, crippling the Roman cavalry before they could even engage. And when the elephants charged, their handlers drove them straight into the tightest ranks, where the sheer weight of their bodies could collapse entire sections of the line. But the true brilliance lay in the aftermath. Even when the elephants weren't actively trampling through the ranks, their presence lingered in the minds of the Roman soldiers. Whispers spread through the camp: were there more of these creatures waiting in the dark? Would they strike again when least expected? That uncertainty was Hannibal's real victory. He didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules of warfare, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy can't even comprehend. And yet, for all their terror, the elephants were just the beginning. Hannibal's genius was in layering his psychological assaults, each one designed to erode his enemy's will in a different way. But shock wasn't the only tool in his arsenal. Soon, another ancient commander would discover that sound itself could be sharper than any blade, turning the very air into a weapon of mass confusion. Genghis Khan's armies didn't just conquer with sheer numbers. They mastered the art of illusion, turning perception into their deadliest weapon. One of their most cunning tricks was the so-called ghost army tactic, where they transformed small, mobile forces into the illusion of an unstoppable horde. Picture a dust-choked horizon, the distant thunder of hooves, but as the enemy squinted, they didn't see just one rider per horse. The Mongols tied dummies onto spare mounts, dressed them in armor, and even rigged them to sway with the movement of the horses. From a distance, a few hundred warriors could look like thousands, their numbers swelling with every gust of wind, but the deception didn't stop there. Mongol scouts rode ahead of the main force, spreading whispers like wildfire, tales of cities reduced to ashes, of armies swallowed whole by the steppe. These stories weren't just exaggeration, they were carefully crafted psychological traps. By the time the Mongols actually arrived, many defenders were already paralyzed by fear, convinced resistance was futile. Entire cities threw open their gates without a fight, preferring surrender to the nightmare they'd been promised. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its simplicity. The Mongols didn't need to waste resources on prolonged sieges or bloody battles when fear could do the work for them. They understood something timeless about human psychology. Once people believe they're outmatched, they often act as if they are. And in war, perception can become reality faster than any arrow finds its mark. Yet the Mongols weren't alone in manipulating appearances to terrify their foes. Across the ancient world, others discovered that light itself could be weaponized. Imagine an army advancing at dusk, their polished shields catching the last rays of the sun, not just to blind, but to transform into a shimmering, inhuman wall. The very air seemed to ripple around them, distorting their numbers, their movements, even their humanity. These weren't just tricks of the light, they were calculated acts of psychological warfare, turning the sun into an ally and the enemy's uncertainty into a lethal weakness. The next time you squint into a glare, remember centuries ago, that same flicker of disorientation could decide the fate of empires. The Persian Empire perfected a form of warfare that didn't just strike the body, it attacked the senses. As their armies marched into battle, they unleashed a storm of sound so overwhelming, it could shatter an enemy's nerves before the first spear was thrown. Picture this, thousands of soldiers slamming their shields together in perfect unison, the metallic clang reverberating like a continuous thunderclap. Chants rose from their ranks, deep and guttural, echoing across the battlefield in waves. This wasn't just noise, it was a calculated sonic assault, designed to drown out commands, disrupt coordination, and plunge opponents into a state of sheer sensory overload. Science explains why this was so effective. Prolonged exposure to loud, erratic noise triggers a primal stress response. Heart rate spike, focus narrows, and rational thought gives way to panic. For enemy soldiers, the Persians' cacophony made it impossible to hear their own officers' orders. Formation discipline collapsed as men flinched at every clash of metal, their instincts screaming at them to flee the unnatural din. Even the most seasoned fighters found their hands shaking, their reactions slowed, as if the noise itself had seeped into their bones. But the Persians weren't the only ones who understood the power of sound. Some armies weaponized silence instead. Imagine facing the Spartans at Thermopylae, their lines eerily quiet, no war cries, no clamor, just the chilling scrape of spears being readied. That absence of sound was just as unnerving as the Persians' noise. It forced enemies to fill the void with their own fears, wondering when and how the strike would come. These tactics reveal a profound truth about ancient warfare. Battles weren't just won with strength, but with psychology. Control the senses, and you control the enemy's mind. And soon, another civilization would take this idea even further. Not with sound, but with sight, transforming their very bodies into living nightmares. The Roman legions prided themselves on discipline. Their tight formations and gleaming armor were symbols of order and civilization. But nothing could prepare them for the sight that greeted them in the forests of Britannia. Emerging from the mist came warriors unlike any they'd faced before. Naked, their bodies painted in swirling patterns of eerie blue, their hair stiffened into wild spikes with lime. These were the Celtic woad warriors, and their very appearance was a weapon. The woad dye wasn't just pigment, it transformed them into something otherworldly, as if the spirits of the land had taken human form. To the Romans, raised on tales of civilization conquering chaos, these warriors were living nightmares, embodiments of the untamed wild they feared most. What made the tactic so effective wasn't just the shock value, it was the cultural disconnect. The Celts weren't just fighting, they were performing. Their rituals before battle, chanting, dancing, working themselves into a frenzy, weren't mere superstition. They were psychological theater, designed to convince both themselves and their enemies that they were possessed by something greater than mortal strength. When they charged, it wasn't in orderly ranks but in a howling, chaotic surge, their blue-streaked bodies seeming to blur together like a storm-given flesh. To the Romans, whose tactics relied on predictability and control, this was the antithesis of warfare. The legions' tight formations, so effective against other disciplined armies, faltered against an enemy who fought like forces of nature. But the woad warrior's greatest weapon was the unknown. Roman historians wrote of their terror at facing warriors who seemed indifferent to pain, who laughed as they fought, as if death itself couldn't touch them. That reputation spread like wildfire through the ranks, turning each encounter into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the time the Celts attacked, many Roman soldiers were already half defeated, their nerves frayed by stories of these demons who couldn't be killed. The Celts understood something profound. In battle, belief is as sharp as any blade. Yet for all their fearsome reputation, the woad warriors were tapping into something even older than war, the human instinct to fear what we don't understand. And soon other armies would exploit this same weakness, not with paint and frenzy, but with something far more insidious: superstition. Imagine an army marching under eclipses they claimed were omens, or planting rumors that their enemies' gods had abandoned them. The mind, once unsettled, is terrain as contested as any battlefield. The Romans didn't just wield swords and shields, they mastered the art of divine theater, turning superstition into a weapon. Take the legendary Legio XII Fulminata, the Thunderbolt Legion. This wasn't just a name, it was a psychological campaign. Before battle, their priests, the augurs, would stage elaborate rituals, studying the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals, then declaring the gods had sent thunderbolts as signs of favor. Imagine the effect on enemies who already feared Rome's might now convince the very heavens fought alongside them. But the real genius lay in the ambiguity. The Romans didn't need actual miracles, they needed their enemies to believe in them. A well-timed storm before a battle could be spun as Jupiter's wrath. A flock of birds scattering inauspiciously over enemy lines became a death omen whispered through their ranks. Even the legions themselves bought into the spectacle. When soldiers believed their victory was preordained, they fought with terrifying confidence. Meanwhile, opposing armies, already outmatched, would second-guess every move, wondering if resisting Rome meant defying the gods themselves. This wasn't unique to Rome. Across the ancient world, leaders fabricated divine favor to tip the scales. Alexander the Great's priests produced prophecies before key battles, while Carthaginian generals staged ritual fires to mirror their god Baal's mythical power. The lesson was clear: in war, faith could be as decisive as force, and soon another civilization would take this idea further, not with thunderbolts, but with something far more personal. Imagine an entire army convinced their leader was literally invincible, his body immune to blades. That's the power of myth, and the Persians knew it well. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer empires, he conquered minds. And nowhere was this clearer than his pilgrimage to the Oracle of Siwa. Nestled deep in the Egyptian desert, this sacred site was where pharaohs sought divine legitimacy, and Alexander, ever the strategist, recognized its power. But his visit wasn't just spiritual, it was psychological warfare on a grand scale. After a treacherous journey through sandstorms and enemy territory, he emerged with a proclamation. The oracle had confirmed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, a living god destined to rule the world. The brilliance of this move lay in its audience. Alexander wasn't just convincing his own troops, he was targeting the cultures he sought to dominate. In Egypt, where rulers were seen as divine, his claim resonated deeply, easing his acceptance as pharaoh. In Persia, where kingship was tied to cosmic favor, it planted doubt. Could mere mortals resist a man backed by the gods? Even his Macedonian generals, skeptical at first, found themselves outmaneuvered by the sheer momentum of the myth. Stories spread of Alexander's miraculous escapes in battle, of oracles predicting his victories, each anecdote reinforcing the idea that opposing him was tantamount to defying destiny itself. But the real masterstroke was the ambiguity. Alexander never revealed the oracle's exact words, allowing rumor and imagination to fill the gaps. By the time his armies reached a new city, its defenders had already heard whispers of his divine favor. Some surrendered without a fight, terrified of angering the gods. Others fought half-heartedly, their resolve poisoned by the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, this conqueror truly was unstoppable. Yet for all its power, Alexander's propaganda relied on something fragile: belief. Remove that, and the illusion crumbled, as the next example shows. While Alexander convinced enemies they couldn't win, another commander would go further, making his own allies doubt their loyalty. Imagine not just fearing your opponent's destiny, but questioning whether your closest comrades had already betrayed you. That's where psychological warfare turns truly sinister. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is an open door. That's the lesson Zhuge Liang, the legendary strategist of China's Three Kingdoms era, taught the world with his audacious, empty fort strategy. Picture a vulnerable city, its defenses stripped bare, its army miles away, yet as the enemy approached, they found the gates swung wide, the walls unmanned. Inside, Zhuge Liang sat calmly atop the ramparts, playing his guqin as if without a care in the world. To the invading general Sima Yi, a man who knew Zhuge Liang's reputation for cunning all too well, this wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. The silence was louder than any war drum. Every plucked string seemed to whisper, "Walk into my web." Sun Tzu's famous maxim, "All warfare is based on deception," found its purest expression here. Zhuge Liang didn't just hide his weakness, he flaunted it, weaponizing his enemy's own distrust. Sima Yi, faced with such unnatural calm, couldn't shake the fear that this was all an elaborate ruse. What if archers lurked behind every window? What if the empty streets were a killing ground? The more he hesitated, the more his certainty crumbled, until he ordered a full retreat, outwitted not by force, but by his own imagination. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its understanding of human nature. When faced with the inexplicable, our minds race to fill the void, often with our worst fears. Other commanders would later exploit this same principle, turning enemy paranoia into their own defense. During the Crusades, a besieged castle once lit every torch along its walls at night, making its handful of defenders appear legion. In feudal Japan, a daimyo ordered his troops to scatter rice across a mountain pass, fooling pursuers into believing his starving army still had supplies to waste. But Zhuge Liang's empty fort stands apart because it required no props, no theatrics, just the unbearable weight of doubt. He proved that the best deceptions aren't about creating illusions, but about guiding your enemy to invent them for you. And while this tactic relied on stillness, others would discover that chaos could be just as potent. Imagine an army that didn't just trick their foes into retreating, but into attacking themselves. That's where psychological warfare turns the battlefield into a hall of mirrors. The Byzantines didn't just wield fire, they weaponized the unknown. Picture the terror of an enemy fleet closing in on Constantinople's walls, only to face a horror no sailor could comprehend. Jets of liquid flame roaring across the water, clinging to ships and skin alike, impossible to extinguish even as men dove into the sea. This was Greek fire, a nightmare made real, but the true genius wasn't just the flames, it was the deliberate mystery surrounding them. The exact recipe, a state secret guarded like a sacred text, was known only to a select few. Emperors whispered that angels had delivered the formula in a dream, while captured enemies spun tales of sorcery. The Byzantines fed these rumors, staging demonstrations where fire arced through the air like dragon's breath, ensuring every would-be invader carried the legend home. What made Greek fire so devastating wasn't just its physical destruction, it was the paralysis it induced. Fleets that could weather storms and outmaneuver arrows broke formation at the mere sight of the bronze siphons mounted on Byzantine ships. The psychological toll was calculated. Crews would mutiny rather than face the flames, and admirals altered entire battle plans to avoid engaging at close range. Even the smell, a nauseating mix of sulfur and burning pitch, became a weapon carried on the wind to trigger panic before the first flame was lit. Yet the Byzantines understood something deeper about fear. Its power grows in the shadows. By never revealing how Greek fire worked, they turned every encounter into a guessing game. Was today the day the inferno would come? Was that odd barrel on the deck a hidden siphon? The uncertainty was as corrosive as the flames themselves, and when the weapon wasn't used, its absence became a threat had the Byzantines devised something worse. This interplay of spectacle and secrecy reveals a timeless truth. Scarcity magnifies terror. A weapon seen too often becomes familiar, but one glimpsed rarely or never fully understood lingers in the mind like a curse. The Mongols grasped this when they let a few survivors escape their massacres to spread word of their ruthlessness. The Spartans knew it when they staged their eerie, silent marches. Fear, when rationed like a precious resource, becomes self-replicating, and soon others would discover that the mere hint of a threat could be sharper than its execution, like an empire that conquered half the world not with fire, but with rumors of an army that never arrived. Scipio Africanus understood something many conquerors overlooked: the power of visible despair. During the final siege of Carthage, he didn't just blockade the city or tunnel beneath its walls. He orchestrated a spectacle of hopelessness, ordering his troops to systematically burn Carthage crops and orchards within full view of its starving defenders. Imagine the scene: families clinging to the battlements, watching their last lifeline curl into smoke, the air thick with the scent of burning grain and olive trees that would never bear fruit again. This wasn't just destruction, it was psychological torture, a slow-motion execution of Carthage's future. The brilliance of Scipio's cruelty lay in its inevitability. Sieges often dragged on for months, with defenders clinging to the slim chance of relief or a negotiated peace. But by torching the fields, Scipio eliminated that uncertainty. Every flickering flame was a countdown to starvation, a reminder that no ally was coming, no miracle would save them. The Carthaginians didn't just face hunger, they faced the unbearable weight of knowing exactly how their end would unfold. Morale didn't just dip, it shattered. Soldiers deserted, leaders squabbled. The city's resolve crumbled like the charred husks of its vineyards. This tactic revealed a dark truth about human psychology. Suffering is easier to endure when there's ambiguity, when the mind can invent escapes. Scipio removed that comfort, turning the siege into a theater of despair. Centuries later, generals would echo his strategy, not just with fire, but with propaganda. During the American Civil War, Sherman's march to the sea wasn't just about destroying resources. It was about demonstrating to the Confederacy that their cause was irreparably broken. In World War II, Allied bombers dropped leaflets over Axis cities detailing upcoming raids, ensuring civilians had days to dread the inevitable. But Scipio's true innovation was in understanding isolation as a weapon. By severing Carthage from its food supply, he didn't just starve bodies, he starved hope. And soon, another commander would take this idea further, not by burning fields, but by erasing an entire people's belief in their own destiny. Imagine an army that didn't just conquer cities, but systematically rewrote histories, ensuring the vanquished forgot they'd ever been free. That's where psychological warfare crosses into something even darker: the annihilation of memory itself. 2 words, that's all it took to etch a moment into history. When the Persian Emperor Xerxes, commanding an army so vast it drank rivers dry, demanded the Spartans lay down their weapons at Thermopylae, King Leonidas didn't rally his troops with a speech. He didn't negotiate, he simply said, "Molon Labe, come and take them." On the surface, it was defiance, but beneath those two words lay a masterclass in psychological warfare. This wasn't just bravado, it was calculated theater. Leonidas knew the Persian army thrived on intimidation. Their very numbers meant to paralyze foes into submission. By refusing even to acknowledge their demand seriously, he flipped the script. Suddenly, it wasn't the Spartans who were outmatched, it was Xerxes, forced to prove his might against a force so confident they invited the attack. The message rippled far beyond that narrow pass. Greek city-states wavering between resistance and surrender heard those words and found their spines. Persian soldiers, accustomed to enemies crumbling at the sight of their banners, now faced men who dared them to advance, but the real genius of Molon Labe was its simplicity. Unlike grand speeches or elaborate ruses, it couldn't be misquoted, mistranslated, or diluted. It was a verbal gauntlet thrown so sharply, it cut through the noise of war. And crucially, it played on a universal truth. Bullies falter when their victims stop flinching. Xerxes, for all his power, couldn't let the challenge stand unpunished, yet every assault he launched into that choke point only deepened the legend of Spartan invincibility. Yet for all its power, Leonidas' defiance relied on something the Spartans understood better than anyone: the weight of expectation. Their entire culture was built on the myth of the unbreakable warrior, and Molon Labe wasn't just a reply, it was a performance, reinforcing the very reputation that made their enemies hesitate. Contrast this with their most chilling weapon, silence. Before battle, while other armies clashed shields and roared war cries, Spartans advanced in eerie quiet, the only sound the rhythmic scrape of spear on shield. That absence of noise was its own psychological assault, forcing foes to fill the void with their own doubts. Defiance and silence, two sides of the same coin. One shouted a challenge, the other whispered a threat. Both proved that in warfare, what isn't said can ring louder than any battle cry. And while the Spartans wielded both with precision, another civilization would discover that sometimes the most devastating psychological weapon isn't a taunt or a hush, but a laugh. Imagine an army so confident they found humor in the face of death. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer, they rewrote the map of human lives. Their signature tactic, mass deportations, wasn't just about control, it was a surgical strike against identity itself. Imagine entire cities uprooted, families marched hundreds of miles from their homelands, resettled among strangers who spoke different tongues, worshipped alien gods, and sang unfamiliar songs. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated psychological dismantling. By severing people from the land that held their ancestors' bones, the rivers where they'd fished as children, the temples where they'd prayed for generations, the Assyrians didn't just move bodies, they erased the very roots of rebellion. The genius of this strategy lay in its slow violence. A warrior might resist the sword, but how does one fight the gnawing loneliness of displacement? Uprooted communities, scattered like seeds in foreign soil, lost the cohesion needed to organize revolt. Parents couldn't pass down traditions when their children absorbed the customs of their new neighbors. Languages fractured, gods faded, and with them, the collective memory of who these people had been before conquest. The Assyrians understood something profound. Culture is the glue of resistance. Remove it, and defiance crumbles into survival. But the real psychological masterstroke was the illusion of mercy. Unlike outright slaughter, deportations let the Assyrians pose as benevolent rulers granting life, just not their lives as they'd known them. This twisted gratitude became its own shackle. Survivors whispered, "At least we weren't killed," even as their identities unraveled. and for those left behind in emptied cities, the silence of missing neighbors screamed louder than any battle cry, a warning etched not in blood but in absence. Yet the Assyrians didn't stop at breaking communities. They pioneered tactics that targeted the individual mind. Prisoners were often blinded or maimed in ways that left them alive but visibly marked as conquered, turning every survivor into a walking monument to Assyrian power. The message was clear: resistance didn't just risk death, it risked becoming a living cautionary tale. This shift from collective to psychological punishment marked a dark evolution in warfare, proving that sometimes the deepest scars aren't on the body, but in the space between memory and belonging. Ramses II didn't just fight battles, he fought perception, turning a near disaster at Carthage into a masterpiece of spin. When his forces clashed with the Hittites along the Orontes River, the battle ended in a bloody stalemate, with both sides too exhausted to claim decisive victory. But you'd never know it from the towering temple walls of Egypt, where artisans carved scenes of Ramses single-handedly crushing the Hittite hordes, his chariot charging through waves of cowering enemies. This wasn't just royal bragging. It was one of history's earliest documented campaigns of mass persuasion, a lesson in how leaders can reshape reality by controlling the narrative. What made Ramses' propaganda so effective was its multimedia approach. Poets composed epic verses describing his divine intervention, scribes distributed scrolls boasting of his triumph, and artists depicted him as a god-king bathed in the favor of Ammon. Even the captured Hittite spies shown in reliefs were likely staged, a theatrical touch to sell the illusion of total dominance. The message was relentless. Ramses didn't just win, he rewrote the rules of war. And for the average Egyptian who'd never set foot on a battlefield, these images became truth. The pharaoh understood something timeless. When you flood the culture with a single version of events, doubt withers. But the real brilliance lay in the audience. Ramses wasn't just convincing his people, he was intimidating future enemies. Foreign dignitaries visiting Thebes would see those carvings and carry tales of Egypt's invincibility back to their homelands. Potential rebels within Egypt, weighing their chances against the throne, faced a barrage of art and verse insisting resistance was futile. The Hittites themselves, despite knowing the battle's true outcome, eventually signed a peace treaty favorable to Ramses, proof that perception could bend diplomacy. This wasn't an isolated tactic. Centuries later, Augustus Caesar would commission poets like Virgil to recast Rome's civil wars as a divine plan for his reign. Medieval kings hired chroniclers to document their miraculous escapes in battle. Even today, the echoes of Carthage linger in the way power constructs its own legends. Ramses' true victory wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the collective memory he engineered, where a draw could be carved into a destiny. Yet for all its impact, his campaign relied on something fragile, a monopoly on storytelling. The moment alternate narratives emerge, whispered in taverns, scribbled on smuggled parchment, the illusion cracks. That's why the most ruthless psychological warriors didn't just control the message, they silenced competing voices entirely. Imagine a ruler who didn't just claim victory, but erased all records of his opponent's very existence. That's where propaganda crosses into annihilation. Attila the Hun understood the power of symbols not as mere decorations, but as weapons that struck fear before a single arrow flew. His armies marched under a black flag so infamous, its mere sight sent cities scrambling to surrender. Unlike the bright banners of other armies, this standard was a tapestry of nightmares, stitched with images of ravens picking at bones, wolves howling beneath crescent moons, and skeletal figures looming over battlefields. To the Romans and Byzantines, steeped in the heraldry of eagles and crosses, this wasn't just a flag, it was a prophecy. The Huns didn't announce their arrival with trumpet blasts or polished armor. They let their iconography do the talking, whispering of slaughter and desolation long before their horses appeared on the horizon. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its universality. Flags transcended language barriers. A farmer who'd never seen a Hun in his life could glimpse that black standard from a distant hill and know instinctively that death was coming. The symbols were carefully chosen, not random, but curated to exploit deep-seated fears. Ravens signaled carnage, wolves evoked the wildness of the steppe, and the skeletal figures mirrored the afterlife myths of the very cultures the Huns terrorized. It was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form. A single image could collapse morale faster than 1,000 swords, but Attila took it further. He weaponized rumor, ensuring stories of the flag outpaced his army's movements. By the time his forces arrived, many towns were already hollowed out by terror, their defenders paralyzed by the stories they'd heard. The flag wasn't just a threat, it was a self-fulfilling curse. And when the Huns finally attacked, they did so beneath that ominous standard, reinforcing the legend with every victory. The message was clear. Resistance wasn't just feudal, it was an invitation to become another symbol stitched into the fabric of their dread. Yet for all its potency, the flag was just one tool in Attila's arsenal. The Huns didn't just rely on man-made symbols, they turned the natural world against their enemies too. Imagine an army that didn't just march through storms, but timed their attacks to coincide with eclipses, turning the darkening sky into an omen of their wrath. Or warriors who lit wildfires ahead of their advance, so the very air their enemies breathed tasted of ash and doom. Nature itself became an ally, amplifying the terror of the black flag with the uncontrollable forces of the earth. And soon, another civilization would take this idea further, not just using nature's fury, but bending it to their will, or at least making their enemies believe they could. Boudica's rebellion wasn't just an uprising, it was a funeral pyre for Roman ambition in Britannia. When the Celtic queen led her people against their occupiers, she didn't just attack Roman forts or ambush their legions. She unleashed a strategy so brutal, so final, it left even battle-hardened commanders unnerved. She burned everything, villages, granaries, even Londinium, the bustling Roman trade hub, were reduced to smoldering ruins by her own hand. This wasn't mere destruction, it was theater of despair, a message carved into the land itself. If we cannot have freedom, you will not have conquest. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers, accustomed to seizing enemy supplies to fuel their campaigns, suddenly faced a wasteland. No food to plunder, no shelter to occupy, just ashes and the chilling realization that their opponents had nothing left to lose. Boudica's people, watching their homes burn, weren't just fighting for victory, they were mourning the life they'd already lost, and that grief made them ferocious. To the Romans, this wasn't war as they knew it, it was something far more unsettling. How do you intimidate an enemy who welcomes annihilation? How do you threaten those who have already embraced the worst? But the true genius of Boudica's scorched earth lay in its duality. To her people, the fires were a sacrament of defiance, proof they'd rather perish than kneel. To the Romans, they were a mirror held up to their own ruthlessness, and the reflection terrified them. The legions had spent centuries perfecting the art of calculated terror, but here was an enemy who out-terrified them, not with greater cruelty, but with greater willingness to endure it. Even in defeat, Boudica's final act, taking her own life rather than being paraded in chains, cemented her legend. The Romans won the battle, but the story of the queen who'd rather see her world burn than bow lingered like smoke in their lungs. This tactic revealed a dark truth about psychological warfare. Desperation, when weaponized, becomes contagious. The moment an occupier realizes their subjects prefer oblivion to oppression, the illusion of control shatters. Centuries later, others would echo Boudica's strategy, not just with fire but with psychological traps, the Viet Cong's tunnel networks designed to vanish into the earth rather than surrender territory. The Russian scorched earth retreats that left Napoleon's and Hitler's armies starving in the snow, all variations on the same theme. When you strip an invader of their ability to take, you strip them of their purpose. Yet Boudica's flames also illuminated a paradox. Her defiance was unforgettable, but it came at a cost not just to Rome, but to the very people she sought to liberate. This tension between resistance and ruin would haunt rebellions for millennia, because the cruelest psychological trap isn't the one you set for your enemy. It's the one history sets for you, the question of whether annihilation is the price of remembrance or its own kind of surrender. The Scythians turned retreat into an art form, not as a sign of weakness, but as the deadliest kind of invitation. Picture a disciplined Roman legion or a proud Persian column, marching deep into the endless grasslands of the steppe, only to find their elusive enemies scattering like shadows before them. The Scythians didn't stand and fight, they taunted. Mounted archers would appear on the horizon, loose a volley of arrows, then vanish into the rolling landscape, leaving their pursuers seething with frustration. What looked like cowardice was a meticulously crafted trap, the kind that didn't just defeat armies, but unraveled them from the inside out. This was the false retreat, a tactic as elegant as it was brutal. The Scythians knew something their enemies didn't. Discipline cracks under the weight of exhaustion and futility. Imagine chasing an enemy for days across featureless plains, your supplies dwindling, your men's feet blistering, only to watch those same horsemen reappear atop a distant hill just out of reach. Each time the pursuing army slowed, the Scythians would strike again, nipping at their flanks, stealing horses, poisoning wells. The goal wasn't to win a battle, it was to stretch their enemies' nerves to the breaking point. And then, when the pursuing force was strung out, dehydrated and demoralized, the trap would snap shut. The Scythians, who'd been conserving their strength, would suddenly wheel around and attack with fresh fury. Their horses, bred for the steppes, outmaneuvered the exhausted mounts of their enemies. Their arrows, dipped in venom or feces to ensure festering wounds, turned minor hits into death sentences. By the time the opposing commanders realized they'd been lured into a killing ground, it was too late. Their formations had dissolved into chaos, their soldiers more concerned with survival than victory. The genius of this strategy lay in its psychological precision. The Scythians didn't just exploit terrain, they exploited pride. No professional soldier could tolerate the humiliation of being toyed with by savages. Every feigned retreat was a dare, a challenge to their opponent's very identity as warriors. And with each mile they chased, the enemy's frustration grew, clouding judgment until even seasoned officers made reckless decisions. Herodotus wrote of Persian armies driven to madness by these tactics, their once proud columns reduced to starving, sun-stroked stragglers, easy prey for the final ambush. Yet the Scythians' mastery of deception went deeper still. They didn't just manipulate their enemies' emotions, they weaponized their cultural blind spots. To settled civilizations, the steppe was empty, trackless, a void to be crossed. But to the nomads, every hill and gully was a landmark, every seasonal stream a potential trap. The Scythians fought not just with bows and horses, but with the very landscape itself, turning their enemies' ignorance into a fatal weakness. And that's where psychological warfare takes its darkest turn, when it doesn't just target an army's stamina or morale, but its deepest beliefs. Imagine a tactic so blasphemous, so antithetical to an enemy's worldview, that the sheer act of witnessing it paralyzes them with horror. That's the power of taboo and the next weapon in the ancient arsenal. The Aztecs didn't just fight wars, they staged them. Their so-called flower wars were meticulously orchestrated spectacles of terror, designed not to conquer territory, but to harvest captives for sacrifice. Imagine facing an army that saw battle as a sacred duty, their warriors adorned in vibrant feathers and jaguar pelts, not just to intimidate, but to signal their divine mandate. These weren't random skirmishes, they were ritual performances announced in advance like macabre festivals, where the outcome was predetermined in the minds of both sides. The Aztecs didn't need to win every clash, they just needed to feed the relentless machinery of their temples, and their enemies knew it. What made these battles so psychologically devastating was the inevitability woven into their very structure. Opposing city-states, outmatched in resources and indoctrination, would send their warriors into these wars knowing full well the purpose: to be captured, their hearts torn out atop pyramids as offerings to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god. The Aztecs weaponized fatalism itself. Why resist when the gods had already decreed your fate? Why rally your people when their deaths would be spun as divine necessity? This wasn't just physical domination, it was spiritual colonization, a slow erosion of the will to fight back. The brilliance and horror of the flower wars lay in their duality. To outsiders, they appeared as mere battles, but to the Aztecs, they were acts of worship. Captives weren't just prisoners, they were honored participants in a cosmic drama. This twisted reverence made resistance even harder. How do you defy an enemy who frames your destruction as sacred duty? Over time, neighboring societies internalized the narrative, their warriors marching to these ceremonial slaughters with a grim resignation. The Aztecs didn't just break bodies, they broke the very idea of rebellion. Yet this strategy carried its own fragility. When the Spanish arrived, they found allies among the Aztecs' enemies' tribes who'd been psychologically primed for generations to see themselves as destined victims. Hernán Cortés exploited this, turning ritualized dread into a weapon against its creators. The flower wars, for all their terror, had cultivated a landscape ripe for revolt. From the blood-stained altars of Tenochtitlan to the rolling waves of the Mediterranean, psychological warfare took on new forms. While the Aztecs weaponized faith, ancient navies discovered something equally potent: the sheer disorientation of the sea. Picture a fleet advancing under cover of fog, their oars muffled, their sails darkened not just to hide but to appear as phantoms. The ocean, vast and unpredictable, became the ultimate theater of the mind. The Vikings didn't just raid, they wrote their reputation in blood and legend. Among the most chilling tales is the so-called Blood Eagle, a ritual execution where victims' ribs were carved from their spine and pulled outward like wings, their lungs draped over the gruesome display. Historians still debate whether this was historical fact or macabre myth, but one thing is certain: the stories alone were weapons. Imagine a coastal village waking to find a local chieftain strung up in such a manner, or worse, just hearing whispers of it from fleeing survivors. The terror didn't require the act to be real, it only needed to be believed. What made the Blood Eagle so potent wasn't just its brutality, it was its theatricality. This wasn't a quiet killing, it was a performance, a message carved into flesh and left for all to see. The Vikings understood something primal about fear: the unknown is far more paralyzing than the familiar. A swift axe blow could be mourned, but a ritual this grotesque lingered in the mind, warping reality itself. Victims weren't just defeated, they were transformed into warnings, their bodies rewritten as runes of suffering. And the rumors spread faster than longships. By the time Viking raiders reached a new shore, the legend of the Blood Eagle had often arrived first. Defenders already trembled at the thought, their resolve poisoned by the question: could this happen to me? The psychological weight was crushing. Some towns surrendered without a fight, their leaders offering tribute in exchange for mercy. The Vikings, ever pragmatic, happily accepted. Why waste effort on battle when dread could do the work for them? Yet the Blood Eagle's true power lay in its ambiguity. Like a ghost story told around a fire, the lack of concrete proof made it even more terrifying. Was it real? Had someone's cousin actually seen it? The uncertainty forced enemies to imagine the worst, and imagination, as any Viking knew, is the most fertile ground for fear. This blend of myth and menace marked the pinnacle of land-based psychological warfare, but the Vikings weren't finished. Their greatest trick was yet to come. Soon, they discover that the sea itself could be a stage for terror, and their ships wouldn't just carry warriors, they'd carry nightmares. Napoleon understood the intoxicating power of a secret, especially one that wasn't really a secret at all. On the eve of the Battle of Austerlitz, he staged a performance so convincing, it became a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. His marshals were summoned to a dimly lit tent, where the emperor dramatically unfurled a map, pointing to what appeared to be glaring weaknesses in his own battle plan. Supply lines stretched too thin, flanks left vulnerable, the kind of mistakes no seasoned general would admit, unless he wanted them overheard, and overheard they were. Austrian and Russian spies, lurking just beyond the lantern's glow, scurried back to their commanders with what seemed like priceless intelligence. The trap was set. By the time the enemy adjusted their strategy to exploit these weaknesses, they were walking straight into Napoleon's real plan, a devastating pincer movement that would crush their forces by dawn. The brilliance lay in the bait. People trust secrets they've stolen far more than those handed to them. A planted spy was more believable than a false surrender, a forged letter more credible than a shouted lie. This tactic revealed a deeper truth about human nature. The hunger for insider knowledge can blind even the wisest leaders. The Austrians and Russians weren't just outmaneuvered militarily, they were outplayed psychologically. Their confidence in the stolen plans made them dismiss contradictory evidence, like the unusual activity in the French camps or the suspiciously lax patrols along the vulnerable flanks. Napoleon didn't just deceive, he weaponized his enemies' own arrogance, letting them think they'd outsmarted him. By the time they realized the truth, their armies were already collapsing under the weight of their misplaced certainty. Yet Napoleon's gambit at Austerlitz wasn't just about space, it was about time. He didn't just control where his enemies moved, he controlled when they acted. And that's where psychological warfare reaches its most refined form, when commanders don't just manipulate plans, but the very clock itself. Imagine an army that doesn't just feign retreats or leak false orders, but orchestrates an entire campaign around the enemy's perception of time, speeding it up, slowing it down, bending it until reality blurs. That's the final weapon in the ancient arsenal, the illusion of inevitability. As winter closed in during the siege of Moscow, another general would master this temporal trickery, not with leaks, but with patience so unbearable it drove his enemies mad. The longer they waited, the more their own minds turned against them. Time, it turns out, isn't just a measurement, it's a weapon, and in the right hands, its ticks can sound like a countdown to surrender. Zhuge Liang's mastery of psychological warfare didn't stop at empty forts sometimes. The greatest illusion was making time itself an accomplice. Years after his legendary bluff, he staged an encore so audacious, it turned a chessboard into a weapon. As enemy forces advanced on his undermanned city, instead of barricading the gates or fleeing, he did the unthinkable. He climbed the walls, arranged a game of Waiki, and began playing against himself, humming softly as if without a care in the world. Below, the invading general froze. To attack a man so conspicuously at ease would be to walk into a trap. Why else would he linger so casually unless legions lurked in ambush? The longer Zhuge Liang played, the more his hesitation infected the enemy. Hours passed, the sun dipped, and by dusk the invaders withdrew, their nerves frayed by the unbearable weight of uncertainty. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological jujitsu, using the enemy's own momentum against them. The chess game was a prop, but the real weapon was patience. Zhuge Liang understood a fundamental truth: urgency breeds mistakes, while stillness breeds doubt. Every minute the enemy spent agonizing over his motives was a minute not spent storming the walls. And in that suspended time, their imaginations conjured threats far worse than any real army. The lesson: sometimes the most powerful move isn't to act, but to let the clock tick, allowing fear to outpace facts. What makes this tactic timeless isn't just its cleverness, but its universality. These ancient strategies, whether with chessboards, flaming arrows, or ghost armies, all tap into the same vulnerabilities: our fear of the unknown, our need for control, our tendency to see patterns even in randomness. Modern negotiators use strategic silence to unsettle opponents. Athletes ice kickers with timeouts. Even in business, CEOs borrow from these playbooks, letting rumors of mergers or innovations linger to destabilize competitors. The tools change, but the human mind remains the same. As we close this journey through history's greatest psychological gambits, one thread binds them all. Victory doesn't always go to the strongest, but to those who best understand how their enemies think. Whether through terror, illusion, or sheer audacity, these commanders proved that battles are won first in the mind long before swords are drawn, and perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. Even today, in a world of drones and algorithms, the sharpest weapon remains the one no shield can block: the unshakable belief that you've already lost. From the Trojan Horse to Napoleon's staged war councils, these 20 examples reveal a truth as old as conflict itself. The greatest victories aren't always won with swords or siege engines, but in the minds of those who wield them. Psychological warfare isn't just a tactic, it's the art of bending reality to your will, turning fear, doubt, and perception into weapons sharper than any blade. The commanders we've explored didn't just outfight their enemies, they outthought them, using illusions as strategically as armies. And here's the unsettling part: these ancient ploys are everywhere today, just dressed in modern garb. Propaganda campaigns, they're the digital descendants of Ramses' temple carvings, shaping narratives to control belief. Cyber attacks that cripple infrastructure before a single shot is fired. They're the Greek fire of our age, mysterious, devastating, and impossible to fully defend against. Even the viral rumors that sway elections, those are Genghis Khan's whisper networks, turbocharged by social media algorithms. The through line is undeniable. Whether it's a Viking blood eagle or a deepfake video, the goal remains the same: to paralyze your enemy with dread before the battle even begins. But this begs a provocative question. In an era of artificial intelligence and mass surveillance, are we really any less vulnerable than the Trojans who dragged that wooden horse inside their walls? If anything, our interconnected world has made us more susceptible. Ancient armies had to see the Huns' black flags with their own eyes. Today, a single viral post can spread terror across continents in seconds. The battlefield has expanded, but the human mind's weak points: our fear of the unknown, our craving for certainty, our instinct to follow the crowd haven't evolved nearly as fast as the tools to exploit them. So what's the antidote? Awareness. Just as Sun Tzu urged commanders to know your enemy, we must recognize these psychological traps, whether they're deployed in war, politics, or even marketing. History's greatest strategists didn't just master deception, they studied how to resist it. And that's where you come in. Which of these 20 tactics left you most awestruck? Was it Hannibal's elephants stampeding through Roman nightmares, or perhaps Boudica's scorched earth defiance, proving that desperation can outmatch even the mightiest empire? Drop your pick in the comments. Let's dissect the psychology behind these feats together. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's hidden wars of wits, hit subscribe. Because the next time you encounter a story that feels too perfect, a rumor that spreads too fast, or an enemy who seems inexplicably confident, you'll know to look for the ancient shadows moving behind the curtain. After all, the oldest tricks are often the hardest to see coming.